4, check. 1, yeah, there we go. That's better. Look, this, it's recorded at least. Works. So I think we could do that. I thoroughly enjoy answering questions on anything that you have seen so far, but also, at least in the .NET API, the validator is where most of the my current implementation effort is going. And so I wouldn't mind if you were interested in sharing with you a few details of where I'm heading with the .NET API validation stuff. So that we can do. And what on your side?
So I guess the one thing, if I can't get the monitor going, I might not be able to code because I'm sure there's no Java IDE on this, but that's okay. I'm not too worried about that. One thing, we could give it a shot. Don't worry about it. We'll figure that out as we go. The other thing, so Graham came up to me and reminded me we should talk about, there's a whole bunch of new tooling with the command line validator that Graham has been enhancing later. So he asked me to spend a bit of time going over how that stuff works, just because it's kind of a useful tool. So I'll talk about that after, because I can do that from the internet on your laptop, so that'll work out well.
Oh yeah. So how are we going to make sure that now your laptop works? Do we need to change the resolution or? Okay. So one thing I did is prepare a Visual Studio with everything in, but that kind of sucks. So I'll start with, oh no, that's wrong. I'll start with a clean Visual Studio project to show you how you would do that. Of course, there's a much bigger risk of things going wrong, but that's part of the fun. So let's do File, New Project. And I'm starting, so we fully support FireNet Core currently. That's mostly what I'm doing now. So let's create a FireNet Core application. So that basically means it would run on anything, including your Mac and Linux. And Microsoft actually made that work. I don't know how they deal with all the forward slashes and backward slashes in path and all those nasty details, but it does work without any recompilation. All my stuff works on Linux as well. So the first thing that I do with this empty project is say, well, let's add the necessary NuGet packages to use the validation. So let's browse the internet here, and let's say fire. Let's see what happens if I do that. Here we go. And so I was talking about the HL7.fire.specification library, and let's take the STU3 one. Yes, install it in the project. Yeah, I think I accept all that stuff. So the first thing you'll notice is that while installing this package, something was added to my project. We're here. Specification.zip. It's a smaller font. And as I was telling you, this contains, well, much like an IG package already, all the things that I need to validate. So I could presumably add organout.zip here as well. But in this case, specification.zip is now packaged with my application. And some of the basic validation classes will just look for this specification.zip, which is the default. Okay, so, well, I do think it's rather boring showing you me typing, so I do have a bit of main code here. So program should have an empty main. Yeah, it does. Programming with one hand. Paste this code. Oh, that's a double main. Yep. So as I was showing, you know, in that last session, but there are some new faces here. Here is one of those sources, zip source.create validation source. What that will do is find a validation source, so that's input for the structure definitions, and it would specifically look for specification.zip. but you could also create a new zip source with an explicit name, and then you could lead that to, say, the Argonaut zip file. And then there's a directory source here that looks for profiles stored in C data my profiles. Those two combined go into the multi-resolver and so on. Well, there's a lot of red squigglies here, so I'll ask Visual Studio to add the right using statements. That's better. This one as well. And, well, because of... So what I'm doing here is I'm constricting a patient, just saying active is true, because that's the only thing I think that is required. So it would be better to leave it off and see if that actually produces an error. Even that's not, I think you can't send something empty. Well, let's see what happens. So let's just, and as you can see, the validator here, it has a thing called results, which is an operation outcome. Now, this is an operation outcome on steroids because I added methods to it to say, is it a success? Because operation outcome itself, I found really usable as my base structure for reporting the outcomes, even the warnings and so on. Everything you need is in it. So with that fancy results here, there's, you can also say results dot, because you say you could filter on warnings. Let's say, see, there's also the number of warnings in it, or let's see if was it filter, fatals, and so on. I did that by using that neat C# feature, also called extension methods, whereby as soon as you're adding this package, you get extra methods on operation outcome, turning it into some kind of full report-like structure for the validation output. I love extension methods. Anyway, what it's doing, it's validating it. It says, well, just turn it into a string so we have a human-readable report and wait for a read line. So let's see what happens when I press play. I think it should report something to us. Element must not be empty at patient. Yeah, so it says at patient root something's wrong, which what I was hoping it would say. And then, of course, if we'll do the active is true, we should have some kind of success here. Oh. Yeah, overall result, success. So that worked from a perspective of the validator, and that's more or less the basics. I mean, there's lots of other other configurations. So if we take a short look at the validator settings, well, probably there's quite a lot, but you always need more. And I wonder, sometimes those are the details. I wonder about how Happy did that. As you can see, one of the validation settings is actually pointing to this resolver. And of course, these all have kind of configuration options as well. So it's, all in all, generate a snapshot or not. So the snapshot generator all by itself is a difficult operation, turning a structure differential into a full snapshot, and that's been called from the validator. So there's all kinds of things you can do there.
What's the implication of setting that to true or false?
So if you set that to false and there is no snapshot, it would report that it requires a snapshot and not do something. So here's the full settings. There's also snapshot generator settings because if you need to generate it, you want to supply the settings. Skip constraint validation because that's pretty expensive. But I was saying to Richard here already, this summer I want to split up the validator into something like you have. So modular set of rules that you could either enable or disable. So what I want you to do is not, and I go a little bit further than what Java now has. I want you to be able to say, you know what, validate everything except for terminology. Because if it fails all that other stuff, I don't want to spend time on terminology until you pass all the other rules, which kind of makes sense because terminology validation is expensive. And one of the sets of rules you can enable or disable would be do structural validation or not. Because if you know that you're going to do profile validation, I don't think you want to do structural validation because that's a subset of profile validation. So that's the ideas I'm playing with. So that's the basic of running it in .NET. Are there any questions about that? Yeah. 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 Yeah, that's actually that is actually comparable currently to the structural validator. So your question was the .NET library itself in the POCO library has a validator that runs fully on the POCOs because every single element, and this must look. Let's see, I have an open Visual Studio here. The whole model, maybe just like the Java model, is decorated with annotations. Well, that's not concept. Whatever. Why did I pick that one? Concept map. No, I should go into the. This is the handwritten stuff. Of C# allows you to spread your code in multiple classes, which is pretty useful now and then. And this is the generated stuff that has all kinds of annotations on it, indicating whether something is required or not. So here, fire element type, well, this just has an order, so it's not mandatory, but that's all there. For cardinality constraint here, for example, is one. And so there is a separate validator that's not integrated with this technology that I was just saying that validates your instance against these attributes. But I didn't have to do a lot for that because Microsoft itself provided a validation kind of validation functionality for these attributes. In fact, if you integrate this into your user interface, if you bind this to your user interface, and the user interface would put a value into these, then it would automatically run these constraints. I wouldn't have to do anything about that. So I followed Microsoft's framework rules for having some of these validations in here. And in fact, one of the biggest users of that is our Forge tool, because that immediately shows validation errors based on this. But that's a total separate thing. But maybe I would integrate that kind of validation as a module as well into the main validator. Yeah. But yeah, you would have to run them separately. So first that one, and then the main validator. Yeah, yeah. So you do the lightweight first. You could do that, and then the other one. Yeah. All right.
Cool. I'm going to try and plug in once more. This time I'll do it with the mini HDMI, and maybe that'll work. And if not, I will give up and do something else.
We do have the mini. We do. Then we even have the option of trying VGA.
Yeah, no kidding. Well, if it doesn't work, I'm not going to spend any more. Hey, there we go.
Yeah,
lovely. It worked for a second, but then it stopped. We could do V8. No, I don't want to bore people with watching us make this work. I'm going to work on your computer because there's nothing worse than watching a presenter screw around with resolution settings for 20 minutes.
Somewhere here, yeah. It's directional, yeah.
There we go. Okay, done. Okay, so I'm not gonna. You know what? Ultimately, what I was gonna go through on my laptop was a little example of going through the validator. I don't think it's terribly necessary, only because I had code samples up on the slides that I went through. All of the examples they're all a part of the Firestarters package. So if you want to play with validation and see it run, the first thing you should do is literally Google Firestarters, FHIR starters. You will find a GitHub repository with that name that has a whole bunch of samples in it, including samples of validation. And anything I could have showed you, you'd be able to do yourself. They're ready to go sort of examples. And that includes validation, it includes servers, it includes clients. So, pick your thing with HappyFire. There's a bunch of examples on there of that. The thing I'm going to show you instead of that, just because There we go. So Graham came up to me between sessions and said, he reminded me that it would be a good idea to talk quickly about the command line validator tool, which, I mean, oddly enough, is using a bunch of the underlying Java infrastructure, is, I guess, only tangentially related to this, but is super, super useful if you're building real solutions, just because it's a nice sort of command line way of getting validation going and figuring out, does your data look proper?
But is it calling your validation software?
No, no, no. So it's totally separate. It's a bunch of Java code. It can be configured to talk to terminology services. I think by default it calls out to tx.fire.org, which is Graham's terminology server. This is, yeah. Yeah, so this is the core spec build validator, which is ultimately the heart of Happy's validator as well.
Okay, so you didn't rewrite the validator.
No, I didn't have the heart to do that, no. I can't even imagine how you did. So it always takes me 20 minutes of staring at this thing, looking for fire, and then eventually deciding that, and then looking for the fourth one in the list, which is...
fourth one on the list.
Why am I... Fire managed, there it is. Okay, so I went to wiki.fire.org just to repeat the embarrassing process I just went through. And on there, I, of course, lost it. I'm going to try this again, but this time I'm going to look for fast. Healthcare. Seriously? Oh my God.
I think you had it.
Yeah, I think I did too. There it is right there. So I'm looking for the word fire. This is the wiki page for fire. I will go there. I'm terrible at driving your laptop for some reason. Oh, it's opening in new tabs. This is embarrassing watching me do that. You're getting a comedy show for free. So, whoa, what am I doing? Okay, the thing I'm looking for is validator, and I'm going to once more look for validator. There we go, using the fire validator. So this is the page I was after, and so Graham was pointing out to me, apparently a week ago, he spent a whole bunch of time beefing up this page. I hadn't even seen this until he pointed it out to me, but it's really good. There's a bunch of good stuff on here. So ultimately, within the Fire spec, I'll show you in a second where to download this thing. But once you've downloaded this tool right here, you can basically point it at files on your disk. You can point it at various IG packs. This is a new way I didn't even know that existed, to sort of point it at core definitions or at IG packs that have been uploaded up onto the Fire auto build site. In true Graham form, there are 1,000 undocumented things on here that he showed me and said, make sure you show, and I forgot the second he showed them to me. So I can't give you all of the power on this, but there is a ton of information in here. As example, I mean, this is a command you would run that would validate against the US core definitions. The nice thing here is you don't need to go and do anything with this. You provided this definition. The validator tool knows where to go and fetch the IG pack for US core, which is kind of cool. I don't even actually know how it does that, but apparently it works quite well, so there we go. This is how this thing works. I'll show you where to get this tool, the validator tool, just because that's useful as well. I'm way better at finding that than I am at navigating the wiki, fortunately. You go to hl7.org/fire, which if you haven't memorized that yet, you should, because that's where the Fire specification itself is. Hopefully that will come. One of the really nice things about the Fire spec is every single page is just memorizing something.html after this base URL, which is super cool.
Yeah, so because I never use Microsoft browser, so that's the problem.
Oh, are you serious? I'm using Internet Explorer and...
Really?
Oh, I know.
So if you do hl7.org, then whatever you need is already there.
Yeah, no kidding.
Fire, let's see.
Oh, that's more like it. Okay, so
it remembers the page.
the thing I was looking for is down at the bottom somewhere. There's a link that's called download. And where did the download link go?
Is that in the documentation download?
Oh, it's moved, of course. Here I was saying I was better at finding that, and I'm no longer. There it is, downloads. Okay, so I'm going to downloads here. When I go to downloads, there is a whole bunch of stuff on here, but the thing I'm after is the official Fire validator. So when you download this, that's the tool that I was just pointing you through the wiki. So this in terms of sort of building up systems, this is Graham's code for validating. So I would say it's as close to a source of truth about sort of how stuff validates as you're possibly going to get, which is good. That's I think all I've got to say there. I mean, are there any questions about sort of validation in Java or anything else anyone wants to discuss? Yes. Yes. So the question for the group, of course, is, well, first off, a comment that you were the one that convinced Graham or bothered Graham until he beefed up the wiki page, which is great. That's the more people that bother Graham to improve documentation, I would say, the better. Hopefully he doesn't watch this video later and realize I'm saying that, but there you go. So the second question, of course, is it is, of course, possible. Like the official Fire validator is a jar file. Because it's a jar file, you can certainly embed it into your Java code. You're not technically using Happy doing that, but it is a thing that works. There are some functional differences between Happy's validator and the reference validator, I'll call it. In terms of the actual semantics of validation, there are no differences. Like the actual validation engine itself is identical. Like what Happy has is a copy of those same classes. But there's a bunch of the sort of infrastructure that surrounds it that's different. The way that it fetches profiles, the way that it fetches IGs, that type of thing is all a little bit different in Happy. I'm not personally aware of anything that can be done with the reference validator that can't be done with Happy's validator. I'm sure there is something. Like I'm definitely not saying there is. Well, so this is kind of an interesting one, and we actually ran into this at the break as well. So this is, actually I'm curious about how you do this in .NET as well. One of the things that I keep thinking about this and then forgetting about it, and we should fix it in Happy Fire, is there is no way of saying to the Happy validator, I want you to validate against this profile over here, other than declaring that profile in your metadata section in your resource. I would like to fix that. There's definitely, this isn't like a religious thing where I don't want to fix it. It's just we keep forgetting. Right. Right. So, I mean, the good news there, that sounds like 3 lines of code to add Happy. I don't see why we wouldn't. Right. Right.
So it's like, you mean something like this. You were wondering in the .NET, that's not rocket science, but you know, the instance and then a list of string with the definition you write.
Yeah, so that basic thing, that doesn't exist in Happy right now.
Okay.
It should, for sure. Yeah, this has been a constant sort of, I don't know, irritation. I think a lot of people have run up against the same thing you are, which certainly tells me we should get on it. Yeah. Right, makes sense. I will add that to my list of things to do this evening. I mean, that's 3 lines of code. I'm sure I can scrape out that time. What's that? Oh, of course. I'm really good at that. Yeah. Oh no. Now we got recorded video evidence.
So any more questions? So I think in a break I was asking you. You said structural validation is cheap. I said, but you need to get even structural information. You need to get from somewhere. So your structural validation is also based on those attribute elements, just like in the .NET API, right? Okay. Yeah. So just as a heads up for if you're working with the .NET API, I'm actually going to provide something that that does something like that, but I've abstracted it again a little bit more away. So it's going to be I'm going to introduce a set of readers, XML and JSON readers that implement that element navigator interface, so you can run validation on top of them. But one of them would have an interface that provides basic structural input. So instead of requiring a whole structure definition, which is big, it's an interface with just the structural aspects that you need to do structural validation. And one of the implementations obviously is running on top of structure definition, and one of the implementations obviously is running on top of the attributes in the POCO. So you could decide on whether you want it derived from your POCO classes or the sometimes more expensive to get stuff. So there's now a class in the new, it's not yet in production, there's now an untyped XML DOM Fire Navigator here, which is the lowest level implementation of that element navigator class that will accept almost anything. So it doesn't do any validation at all. And you'd think that's weird, but there's actually quite a few uses for that. For example, both Forge and Simplifier like to be able to read Fire files even if they're partly crap or from an unexpected Fire version. So this reader actually has almost no assumptions. And then you can stack on top of that a type reader which connects the data you're having here in the instance with some of that type data. And once those two are combined, then you can decide on which rules you want to, because once you've combined it with a structure definition, you can then say, okay, now I want to do terminology validation, now I want to do this, I want to do that. So kind of designing a structured, set of navigators that going to do that. But I'm gonna work on that. Well, I was working on that, getting on the plane here, and so you see these red squigglies here, because what I was also building was your the class you have to report errors. Right now, the thing you get is an operation outcome. But on the lower levels, that's actually when it's something like an event. So if something happens, trigger a callback in the calling class instead of throwing exceptions. Exceptions are exceptionally expensive. So I'm copying that approach in the .NET API as well. It's not finished yet, but just to give you a heads up of what's going on. We're copying each other's approaches back and forth. So, all right. Thank you all.
Thanks, guys.